Hello everyone, my name is Paulo Alves, and on this video we are going to create the state management for our real app using the Ionic framework. We'll use NgRx in order to do that, and we'll create a loading component that we'll be able to use in multiple parts of our app. Subscribe to the channel if you want to follow this development, and let's take a look on what we are going to have built by the end of this video. We'll add the NgRx state management library to our app, and we'll be able to easily show a loading component at any page or any point we want in our app. For example, I made it show up when I click on the forgot email password, so let me just inform any email, and when I click on the button, the loading component is shown. A few seconds later, it disappears. This is being done with NgRx by dispatching an action to show the loading component and another action to hide it 3 seconds later. If I want to show the loading component at any other page, I can just use this line right here. So let's go to the code. NgRx is a library created for Angular and Ionic that implements the idea of Redux and adds state management to our app. Let's take a look on how to add it to our app. First, I'll go to the documentation and I'll enter the installation part. Here we can see that to install it, we need to execute this command. So let me copy this command and go to the command line and paste it. I'll also add another library that will help us to easily see and kind of debug what's happening on our store. So to install this other library, I have to inform npm to install at ngrx/store devtools. Alright, NgRx is installed. Now let's create the configuration of it. I like to create a separate folder to contain all the app state and the store of my app. I'll create a file that will contain all the configuration of NgRx. This file is going to be called appStoreModule.ts. Inside of it, I will export a constant called appStoreModule, and then we initialize this array with the storeModule.forRoot, and this forRoot will have an empty array. So now our store is configured. Alright, it's not doing much yet, but we'll come back to that later. Now let's reference what we just created in our file app.module.ts. So the NgRx configuration is available for the whole app. Let's also add the store devtools that will make our lives easier in the near future. Alright, now the NgRx is added to our app. Now let's actually do something with it. In the Redux world, we have a few components and concepts like the store, the states, the actions, the reducers, and the selectors. Maybe you didn't notice, but we already defined our store, which is the place where all the app state is gonna exist. It's defined right here in the App Store module. A store can have multiple states, but our store for now doesn't have any state. So let's start by creating our first state, which will be the loading state. This state is going to be used by our app to show or hide the loading component. So I'll add to the store folder a new folder called loading. This folder will contain everything that's necessary for our loading state. Now I'll create an interface called loading state, which will have the properties of the loading. The only thing our loading state needs to know is if it should show or not the loading component. So it needs only one property. And this property is a boolean called show. Alright, so we already created the interface that represents the loading state. Now let's create the actions of that state. An action is an instruction that will be sent to the store to let the store know what has to be done and what has to be updated. So I'll create a file called loading.actions.ts. This file will contain all the actions for the loading state. So let's create our first action, which will be the action to show the loading component. I'll export a constant called show that will receive the createAction function of the NgRx library. This action will be identified with this string loading show. Yeah, it is that simple. Now let's create the second action, which will be the action to hide the loading component. I'll just copy and paste it and change from show to hide. Alright, now we have the actions for our loading state. By now we have configured an empty store, created the loading state, and created the actions of that loading state. The next and final element of NgRx that we need to create for the loading state is the reducer. So imagine that we are in the login page and we click the login button. I'll need to call an action to show the loading component. That action is going to be received by the reducer. The reducer will find out what to do with that action, and it will update the loading state inside of our store. So let's create a new file called loading.reducers.ts. This file will have all the reducers for our loading state. I'll create a constant called reducer, and this constant will receive the creation of the reducer. To create that reducer, I'll use the function createReducer of NgRx. A reducer is created with the initial values of our state and also a list of actions that the reducer will work on top of. For now, let's just declare that our reducer is being created with an empty object. And now let's create the list of actions for that loading reducer to work on top of them. The reducer does its stuff based on the action it receives. So I can define that on the show action, the reducer will execute some function. And this function will return the new state to our store. So for now, let's just return an empty object. I can also define that on the hide action, the reducer will execute a function, and that function will for now return just an empty object. Now I will export a function called loadingReducer that will receive the state and the action that will act on top of that state. This function will then return the reducer that we just created for our loading state. And alright, as I told you, we are gonna do stuff using TDD. So let's start our tests. Now that our tests are up and running and everything's passing, let's create the tests for the loading state so we know that we don't break anything when in the future we change our code. I'll come back to VS Code and I will create a file called loading_spec.ts. In this file, we will describe the loading store tests, and I'll create a first test that simply fails. So our test is going to be for the action show. I will start just expecting that false is equal to true. Alright, we have a failing test, so let's start. What my test has to check is if when I call the loading reducer with some initial state and the show action, then the new state will have the property show of our loading state equal to true. So I can start by creating a constant called new state, which will receive the response of what our loading reducer will return. This loading reducer receives as parameter the initial state and the action that will be executed. So I will create another constant called initial state. It will be of the type loading state, and it will be equal to an object that has the property show equal to false. And now we can send this initial state as the first parameter to our loading reducer and send as the second parameter the action we want to execute, which is the show action. What I have to expect now is that the new state will be equal to an object that contains the show property equal to true. And that's my test. After I save this, our test will fail. And that happens because I'm not doing anything inside of our reducer. So let's just adjust our code to make our test pass. Now in the action show is called on the loading reducer, I'll just return an object that has the property show equal to true. I'll save it, and now our tests will pass. And now let's create the test for when we are trying to hide the loading. I'll come back to our test and I'll just copy the test here that we just created. So the name of the test is going to be hide. The initial state is going to have the show property as true, and instead of show, I will call the action hide. And in the end, I expect that the new state has the property show equal to false. After I save this, our test will fail. It fails because I didn't change the state inside of the reducer. So let's just return an object with the property show equal to false. After I save it, our tests will pass. And there is one more test we need to do here. In case we send some unknown action to our reducer, the reducer shouldn't change the state. So I will copy our last test and change its title to should keep state if action is unknown. So now let's create some unknown action. I will create a constant called action, and I'll pass to this constant the create action function from NgRx, and this action will be identified with the string unknown. Now I only need to pass the action here to our state. And also, as our initial state has the show property equal to true, I should expect that the new state would have also the show property equal to true. After I save it, we see that our test will pass. Let me just go back to false to see if it's gonna fail. Yeah, it did, so our test is correct. Cool, now that we defined our first reducer, let's add it to our store configuration so the NgRx knows that this is a reducer. To do this, I go to the App Store module, I'll add a new element to this array. Now I inform that for our store module, for its feature called loading, it will use the loading reducer that we just created. So let's go back to our reducer and make some improvements to it. You can see that I am passing the initial state as an empty object here, but we know that the initial state will be of the type loading state and that will have the show property as false. So let's create a new constant called initial state that will be of the type loading state and it has the property show as false. And now we can use this as the initial value of our state. This is just to make it easier for us to see what is the initial state of the loading reducer. I can also inform to our reducer function that the state that it's going to receive will be of the type loading state. And for now that's it. Let's save and run the test again to see if anything failed. Alright, everything is correct. Now let's create the loading component that will observe the loading state and show or hide itself. To do this, I have to add a new command line to tell Ionic to generate a new component that will be installed in the components folder by the name loading. Let's close all of this first and go to our created component and implement the way it's gonna look. Let's start by adding an ion spinner that will be of the type crescent. It will have the size equal to 20. The color of it will be green, or the color of success. And let me close this tag. And now let's add this component to a place where it will be visible and available to the whole app. This place is the file app.component.html. I'll just add here at the bottom the tag of our loading component. I also need to inform our app module that it is now using the loading component. Otherwise, we'll not be able to see it on the screen. Now let's run our app. And now let's go to the browser to see if this loading component is being shown. It's gonna be here really quick. Did you manage to see? Let's do it again. Here on the left top part of the app. Yeah, the loading component is being shown, but then the login page shows on top of it. So what we need to do now is to make the loading component to be on the top of everything. Also, it would be cool if it had a backdrop, so let's add it also. So let's go back to our HTML file. And to do this, let's first put the spinner inside of a container that will have the CSS class equal to backdrop. So now let's add the CSS for this component. We'll have the class backdrop. The positioning of it will be fixed. The width is going to be 100%. The height will also be 100%. The background will be of the color black, and it will have the opacity of 0.5. When I save it and we go back to our app, we'll see that the loading component is being shown all the time with a dark background and with some opacity. And now let's just put the spinner in the middle of the page because it's looking really weird. So the backdrop will have a display of flex, and I will also identify that ion spinner, and the flex of it will be 1, and it will align itself in the center. Now let's save and see how it looks. Alright, the loading is in the middle of our page. The only bad thing about it is that it's just not caring about the loading state yet. So let's do this then with tdd and tests to this loading component. I'll go to the test file of our loading component, and I need to create a new test, and on this new test it should hide the loading component when it's not loading. So I'll remove this and I'll create a constant called compiled, which will have access to the HTML code of our page. Then I'll expect that on this compiled, when I query for an element that has the CSS backdrop, it will be equal to null. I mean, the backdrop element doesn't exist, which means that the loading is not being shown. I'll save it, and this is gonna fail because we are showing the loading no matter what. Let me just go back to the tests command line so we can see that it's failing. So what we need to do now is to make our component start observing the loading state and show or hide the loading component based on that state. To do this, I'll come to our loading component and I will inform that this component needs access to the store. I'll save it, and now you'll see that our test will keep failing, but we'll have a really weird error showing up. This is because I need to let my test know how to set up that store. I'm not doing that yet. So let's go back to the test file, and I will inform that this test is importing our store. And to do this, I have to import our store module with the for root receiving an empty array, and also I have to import the store module for feature and put here a loading and the loading reducer. I'll save it, and now we'll see that our test will fail, but the failing is not gonna be that weird. Alright, now let's go back to the loading component and create an attribute called loading state currency. This attribute is of the type observable loading state. So this means that this attribute will be responsible for keeping an eye on the loading state and knowing when the loading state changes. The pattern we use in Angular Ionic for attributes like this is to add a currency sign at the end of the name. And now when the loading component is initialized, we need the loading state observable to be based on part of that store. So we go to the store and select the part of the store that is equal to the loading state. This loading here is coming from the configuration of our store, which is in the App Store module that we just created, loading. And we are having this error here in the loading because we need to declare a type for our store, as for now it's of some generic type. To do this, we could add the type like this. But that solves the problem, but it's not going to be good in the long term when we have multiple states in our store. So if in this loading component we are using multiple states of our store, we would need to add all of them there. What we can do is go to our store path and create a new file called appstate.ts. Here I'm going to export an interface called appstate. In this interface, we will have a property called loading, which will be of the type loading state. Now we can save it, and let's just use this interface as the type of our store. Okay, now we have access to the loading state, but we are not actually showing or hiding the loading component based on it. We are actually not doing anything with the loading component. To do this, we have to go to the HTML file and add here at the backdrop an ngIf statement. On this ngIf, we'll get the loading state property on an asynchronous way, as it is of the type observable and the observable is asynchronous, and we'll just check the show property. If the show property is true, then the loading will show up. If not, then it will be hidden. After I save it, we'll see that our test will pass. If we go to the app, we'll see that the loading component is not showing up anymore. So let's go back to our tests and create our second test. I'll just copy the previous test, and now let's check that it should show the loading component when it's loading. Here I have to expect that the loading will not be null. When I save it, our test will fail because the loading is just not showing up. In order to be able to show the loading component here, I have to first get access to the store in my test. So let's create an attribute called store that will be of the type store with the app state. Now let's go to the setup of our test and instantiate that property using the test bed. Now what I have to do is to execute the show action in the store. So what's going to happen is that the show action will come here to our loading reducer. It will execute this function that returns the show attribute as true, and our loading state is going to be observing this, and it will see that the show is true and the loading will be shown in the screen. So let's do this in our test. To do it, I have to tell the store to dispatch the show action. After I save this, we'll see that our test keeps failing. But this is because on the tests, we need to keep telling the test to detect the changes on the HTML. Now save it and our test will pass. But I can see a problem on here on our first test. What this test is doing is actually to verify if when we create the component, the loading is not being shown. And I know this because if I just change the initial state of the show property in the loading state, this test will fail because now this will not be null anymore. So what I actually need to test here is if when I tell the store to dispatch the hide action, then the loading component is not gonna be shown. So here I also have to tell the fixture to detect the changes. After I save this, our test will keep passing. Okay, cool. Let's now play around with the loading component and make it show up when I click here on the forgot email password button. To do this, I will close everything. I'll come to the login page. I'll inform that the login page now needs the store. And I'll create here in our component a function called forgot email password. This function will tell the store to dispatch the show action. And then 3 seconds later, what I'll do is to tell the store to dispatch the other action, the hide action. I'll save it and our tests will fail, but don't worry, we are just playing around here with what we have. Now what I need to do is to execute this function on the click of our button. Now let's see it working in our app. I'll input any email here and then our button is now enabled. When I click on it, the loading component shows up and 3 seconds later it disappears. Well, to end this video, do you remember that store DevTools package we added to our app so we could better see and debug the changes on our store? If you add to your browser the store DevTools plugin, you have access to the redux tab that's right here. So we can see here that the action show was called and that changed the show attribute from false to true, and then the action hide was called and that changed the show attribute from true to false. We also actually can see the history of our state going around. Yeah, pretty cool, right? So that was it for today. We installed, configured, and started using the NgRx for the state management of our app. On the next video, we're going to continue using NgRx to create the state for our login page. So our login page is going to just react to the state of our app. So hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel in case you're not subscribed yet, but you want to follow the development of this real app using the Ionic framework. Share the video with your friends and see you on the next video.